0247 hours, 150 nautical miles north of the Venezuelan coastline. The Caribbean night was absolute. No moon, no ambient light, the kind of darkness that a vessel running blacked out can disappear into completely if the only eyes searching for it belong to a surface radar with a limited horizon. The crew of La Sombra had built their entire operational theory around that darkness. Their 12-meter go-fast modified with a deep V carbon fiber hull and 3 Mercury Racing 400R outboard engines producing a combined 1,200 horsepower could sustain 80 knots across open water, faster than anything the US Coast Guard maintained in the region. The man commanding it, known in cartel communications only as El Tiburon, had run this corridor 17 times without contact. He understood the geometry of the intercept problem. At 80 knots, the time between a surface radar detection and a vessel capable of matching speed arriving on scene was, in his calculation, comfortably longer than his escape window. El Tiburon's calculation was correct about the surface radar. It was catastrophically wrong about everything else. At 18,000 feet above the Caribbean, an MQ-9B Sea Guardian unmanned aerial vehicle had been tracking La Sombra's thermal and radar signature for 10 continuous hours, from the moment the vessel cleared its clandestine dock on the Venezuelan coast. The UAV's AN/APY-8 Lynx 2 synthetic aperture radar was operating in a focused imaging mode, generating surface resolution comparable to aerial photography, tracking La Sombra's wake geometry and producing predictive vector analysis that updated every 1.3 seconds. That data was flowing in real time through a secure Link 16 data link to a P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft operating 150 miles to the west, where mission systems fused the radar picture with signals intelligence and electronic emissions data into a composite track that had been maintained without interruption since the vessel's departure. That composite picture was transmitted to the Combat Information Center of the USCGC Wachusett, the Coast Guard cutter whose surface radar El Tiburon correctly assessed as inadequate to detect his vessel at the ranges he was operating. The Wachusett was not finding La Sombra with her own sensors. She was receiving a complete, continuously updated targeting solution from a surveillance network that La Sombra had no awareness of and no ability to detect. The cutter was not a lone ship in the dark. She was the forward edge of an integrated kill chain whose rearmost elements were orbiting in the stratosphere. To understand what the JIATF South counter-narcotics operation represented in this engagement, you need to understand why the Panama Canal corridor makes this stretch of Caribbean water strategically significant beyond the narcotics trade itself. Approximately 5% of global maritime commerce transits through the Panama Canal annually. Container ships, bulk carriers, tanker traffic, the physical movement of goods that sustain supply chains from pharmaceutical components to consumer electronics. The smuggling routes that JIATF South was systematically dismantling are not incidental to that infrastructure. They run parallel to it, funded by cartel revenue that in this theater flows with documented regularity into Venezuelan military and government accounts. Challenging U.S. counter-narcotics enforcement operations in this corridor is not a regional criminal matter. It is a proxy contest over who exercises operational authority in the waters adjacent to the most important commercial choke point in the Western Hemisphere. El Tiburon had been hired to make a point. His mission was to disable the Wachusett's propulsion or radar systems with rocket fire and withdraw before a conventional naval response could be organized, demonstrating to the cartel's Venezuelan-connected backers that American enforcement operations carried a cost and that their network could impose it. The RPG-7 launcher his forward crew member was positioning was not a weapon designed to sink a Coast Guard cutter. It was a signaling device intended to communicate that this water was contested. What the cartel's operational planning had not incorporated, because it was not publicly known and had not been observed in previous operations, was that the Wachusett carried a fully armed MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, call sign Angel 14, loitering 10 miles off her beam, or that Angel 14's AN/ALQ-210 electronic support measures suite had been actively profiling La Sombra's communications emissions for the past 40 minutes. Or that the 57mm Mk-110 naval gun on the Wachusett's bow had already received a targeting solution derived from the Link 16 feed and was tracking La Sombra's projected position in real time. Tactical Action Officer Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen watched the track designation on her console shift from monitoring to threat classification at 024714. The MH-60R's acoustic sensors registered the RPG-7 launch signature. a characteristic pressure wave and thermal bloom, at 024731. Time to impact with the cutter at the weapon's muzzle velocity and the closing geometry between the two vessels, 44 seconds. The network had already been processing the intercept for longer than that. For veterans who have stood a watch in a combat information center, who know what the transition from routine monitoring to active threat response feels like through the deck plating and the change in everyone's voice, leave a 1 in the comments. That specific quality of professional focus, the absence of panic where panic would be understandable, is something that takes years to build and is the actual foundation of what happened in the next 44 seconds. Angel 14 received the execute order for the electronic warfare package at 024733. The AN/ALQ-210's focused radio frequency burst was not a broadband jamming signal of the type that any competent adversary builds countermeasures against. It was a precisely targeted emission directed at two specific electronic systems aboard La Sombra, the commercial-grade GPS receiver that El Tiburon's helmsman was using to navigate the pre-planned escape corridor, and the radio frequency power coupling for the night vision equipment the forward crew was wearing. Neither system was military-hardened, neither had been designed to operate in the presence of a focused RF disruption. For the men on La Sombra, the transition was instantaneous. The GPS display, showing the turn bearing and waypoint that represented their extraction route, froze in mid-update, then dissolved into corrupted characters that conveyed nothing. The night vision goggles that had been providing 80-knot navigation capability in total darkness became a white static field. The helmsman was running a vessel at combat speed with no positional reference and no visibility in open ocean at night. El Tiburon was screaming course corrections into a radio whose signal the P-8A's Signals Intelligence Suite was simultaneously capturing, de-hopping, and logging against the cartel's existing communication architecture. Every transmission he made in the next 90 seconds was being recorded and processed into a signals intelligence product that would compromise the network's operational security for the next 72 hours. He did not know this. He had other problems. The RPG-7 round was 38 seconds into its flight when the Wachusett Mk-110 received the fire authorization from Lieutenant Commander Chen. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Harper at the fire control station did not touch a manual trigger. The targeting solution derived from the Link 16 feed had been loaded into the gun's auto-loading and fire control system before the launch was even detected. What Harper confirmed was the authorization, the human decision point that the system required before it would execute. The Mk-110 fired 4 rounds in 1.8 seconds. The first 2 high-explosive pre-formed fragmentation rounds, each carrying approximately 4,000 tungsten sub-projectiles, were guided to La Sombra's engine cluster by the ship's fire control computer using the targeting solution the UAV had been updating for the previous 10 hours. The impact points were selected to destroy the vessel's propulsion without producing a fuel fire that would endanger the crew beyond the engagement itself. At 80 knots, kinetic energy absorbed by the hull structure at the engine mounting points transferred through the vessel's frame with enough force to bring the craft from operational speed to 0 in a distance shorter than its own length. La Sombra stopped. The RPG-7 round, now 43 seconds into its ballistic trajectory, its rocket motor burned out, carrying only the momentum it had accumulated at launch, was aimed at a target that no longer occupied the coordinates its firer had intended. It impacted the water 900 meters short of the Wachusett's hull and detonated against the ocean surface, producing a column of spray that the cutter's crew observed from the deck without concern. The engagement from RPG launched to conclusion, 44 seconds. U.S. personnel casualties, 0. Wachusett hull damage, none. La Sombra, engines destroyed, hull breached, listing. What El Tiburon had funded with his employer's operational budget was, from the American intelligence community's perspective, an information harvest of considerable value. The MQ-9B's 10-hour continuous track of La Sombra's operational pattern from departure to engagement provided analysts with a complete behavioral profile of the cartel's tactical procedures, departure timing, routing logic, crew positioning, communication discipline, the specific modifications to the vessel's engine configuration that produced its distinctive thermal signature at high speed. That thermal profile was immediately incorporated into the automated detection library for the MQ-9B's targeting system, enabling passive identification of similarly modified vessels in future operations without requiring active radar emissions that might alert a target. The signal's intelligence derived from El Tiburón's radio transmissions during the engagement provided the frequency hopping pattern for the cartel's encrypted SATCOM network, a vulnerability window of 72 hours during which U.S. signals collection would have effectively transparent access to communications across the entire network, not just this vessel's crew. The cost to the cartel of the operation: one modified go-fast vessel, one RPG-7 launcher and round, the operational security of their communications architecture for 72 hours, and the behavioral and thermal intelligence profile of their vessel modification program. The cost to JIATF South: 4 Mk 110 rounds at approximately $1,000 each and 44 seconds of fuel for the MH-60R. The asymmetry in that exchange is the point. El Tiburón had structured his operation around a model of American military capability that was accurate for a different era, one in which a Coast Guard cutter, operating in the Caribbean, was genuinely a standalone asset whose organic sensors defined the limits of its situational awareness. That model had a window of validity that closed when persistent UAV surveillance, satellite-linked data fusion, and aircraft like the P-8A Poseidon began operating as integrated components of a single distributed sensor network rather than as separate platforms with separate operational pictures. The era he was operating in assumed seams between sensors, gaps in coverage where a fast, dark vessel could transit unobserved between one radar's range and the next. Those seams no longer exist in this theater in any operationally meaningful way. This is the broader lesson that the Wachusett engagement delivers beyond its immediate tactical outcome. The network does not have a horizon. It does not have a shift change. It does not have a sensor gap that a sufficiently fast vessel can exploit by timing its transit correctly. The MQ-9B that had been tracking La Sombra for 10 hours before El Tiburón pressed a trigger was not assigned to that specific vessel because intelligence indicated an attack was planned. It was on routine patrol, maintaining continuous coverage of the transit corridor as a standard operational posture. The surveillance that found La Sombra was not reactive, it was ambient. Any adversary, as cartel network, state-sponsored proxy force, or conventional military, that plans an operation against a U.S. asset in this theater on the assumption that the target is isolated, that the engagement window belongs to the attacker, or that speed and darkness constitute cover, is building their plan on a foundation that the integrated surveillance architecture of JIATF South has made obsolete. You are not engaging the ship you can see. You are engaging every sensor that has been watching you since you left port, processed through a network that had a firing solution ready before your crew finished the safety brief. The strategic question this engagement poses extends beyond the Caribbean. If a cartel-connected network operating with Venezuelan military protection, using modified vessels specifically designed to exploit the limitations of surface radar, cannot find an exploitable gap in the JIATF South surveillance architecture, cannot find a moment of isolation, a sensor seam, a window in which a single U.S. asset is genuinely alone, what does that imply for a conventional adversary attempting to operate against U.S. naval assets in a contested theater with peer-level electronic warfare capability? The network is not the ships. The ships are the visible part of a system whose actual boundaries are defined by satellite orbits, aircraft patrol radii, and data fusion architectures that exist entirely outside the engagement space any adversary can directly observe or influence. When El Tiburón fired his RPG at 0247, he was not responding to the Wachusett. He was responding to a picture of the engagement that was missing its most important elements. The network had already written the outcome before he gave the order to fire. 44 seconds. That is how long it takes for a system that has been watching you for 10 hours to finish the conversation you started. What do you think? Does the JIATF South engagement model represent the template for how the U.S. projects enforcement authority in contested maritime spaces globally? Or does the Gadir engagement in the Strait of Hormuz suggest that there are still seam vulnerabilities that patience and a favorable acoustic environment can exploit against even the most integrated surveillance network? And was the signal's intelligence harvest from El Tiburón's transmissions during the engagement ultimately worth more to the U.S. than the vessel itself? Leave your read in the comments. The operational thinking in this community consistently sharpens the analysis.